Well, as you remember, the Cold War ends in 1989, and then in 1991, December of 1991, the Soviet Union collapses and disappears, and we enter what's generally called the unipolar moment. So the United States is the only great power on the planet. And it doesn't have to worry about great power politics because there is no other great power on the planet. It's just the United States. So for the first time in our history, we're free to pursue an ideological foreign policy. We don't have to worry about realpolitik. We don't have to worry about the balance of power because we are supreme. Anyway, we adopt this policy called liberal hegemony, starting in the early 1990s, as I said. And I believed from the get-go that we were going to get ourselves into a lot of trouble, that this was a policy that was doomed to fail. I think throughout most of the 1990s, the evidence pointed in the other direction. It made it look like I was wrong. We managed foreign policy in a rather subtle and sophisticated way, even though I think we were pursuing a boneheaded policy. But then in the early 2000s, things began to fall apart. And then I would argue that between 2000 and 2018, when the book was published, liberal hegemony collapsed, and the United States found itself in one disaster after another. So, in a very important way, Glenn, what I was trying to do was examine this liberal foreign policy, which I call liberal hegemony, which began in the early 1990s, and then try to explain to the readers what the major cases were and why I thought the policy was doomed to fail from the get-go.
Yeah, this the rhetoric from the 90s I thought, I thought was fascinating because we could expand an anti-Russian military alliance, which would strip Russia of influence in Europe, yet it was referred to as a democratic community. So if the Russians would oppose it, it was because they feared democracy. And the same as China, the assumption was that if we could pull them into this US-led economic system, they would become more benign, we would have our democratic peace. But how can you explain that we didn't really pay attention though to their concerns? Because if you listen to Beijing and Moscow, they feared that they were being contained. Uh, it seemed to have been dismissed very much just as a Cold War mentality. Does this fit into the liberal delusions?
Well, let's just talk about NATO to begin with. There are three really big cases here that you want to talk about. Uh, One is the Bush Doctrine and what we did in the Middle East. And this, of course, all revolves around 9/11 and the invasion of Iraq. So the Middle East is one case we should talk about. Second case we should talk about is China and the policy of engagement, which you briefly described. And then the third big case, of course, is NATO expansion. So let's focus on that to start. It's very important to understand that in the 1990s, when NATO expansion got going, remember, Bill Clinton makes the decision to expand NATO in 1994. And the first tranche of expansion, which brings in Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, is in 99. But when it starts in the 1990s and even through much of the 2000s, the early 2000s, it's not aimed at containing Russia. It's very hard for people to understand that in the context of 2025, given all that's happened since the Ukraine crisis broke out in 2014. People find it hard to believe that NATO expansion wasn't designed to contain this evil Russia, but it wasn't. You want to remember that in the 1990s, Russia was a basket case. It was economically in a disastrous situation. And in no way was Russia a threat to go on the offensive against Ukraine or in Eastern Europe. It just was not in the cards. So when the Clinton administration started the whole process, what they were interested in doing was taking this giant zone of peace that existed in Western Europe and expanding it eastward to cover Eastern and Western Europe. Uh, they didn't want to bring the Russians into the alliance. There's no question about that. But they were not interested in containing the Russians. They understood full well that the Russians were unhappy with NATO expansion. Clinton did everything he could to assuage Boris Yeltsin's concerns. Clinton thought, that we could expand NATO and at the same time maintain good relations with the Russians. It's just very important to understand that. This was not an anti Russian move. Again, the Clinton administration did not want to bring Russia into the alliance. And that's because Russia would have been a powerful actor inside the alliance. And the United States wanted to run NATO and therefore it wanted to keep the Russians out. But we were not trying to contain the Russians. We were trying to make Europe whole, and we were trying to make Europe peaceful. And that meant making Eastern Europe look like Western Europe. So to put it in more specific terms, we were trying to spread democracy eastward, liberal democracy. We were trying to spread institutions eastward. This is why we were moving NATO and the European Union eastward, right? Because building institutions and incorporating countries' into institutions is part of the liberal enterprise. And then furthermore, we were trying to spread capitalism. We were trying to get everybody in Eastern Europe hooked on capitalism, integrated into the American-dominated world economy. And of course, institutions facilitated this. So this is what liberal hegemony was all about. But of course, as you know very well, Glenn, the Russians were deeply upset about NATO expansion from the beginning. Clinton could try to assuage the concerns of Boris Yeltsin, but it just didn't work very well. And it didn't work very well with other Russian leaders as well. And they protested, but there was nothing they could do to stop it because Russia was so weak. So in 1999, you get the first tranche of expansion, as I said, and the Russians complain bitterly, but can't do anything about it. Then you get the second big tranche in 2004. And again, the Russians complain bitterly. And you know, Putin is now in control in Russia. Since 2000, Putin has been in charge. And he's deeply upset, as was Boris Yeltsin, with NATO expansion. But Putin can't do anything in 2004. So you have another big expansion in 2004. Then in April 2008, we go to NATO, bringing Ukraine into the alliance and Georgia as well. And this is what leads to the catastrophic situation that we're now in, right? Because the Russians, by 2008, have reached a point where they think they can stand up to the Americans. And Putin says, after the April 2008 Bucharest NATO summit, where we say Ukraine will be brought into NATO, Putin says, this is not happening. This is an existential threat to Russia. We will not allow it to happen. So this is the first time NATO faces real resistance. So the question we want to ask ourselves is, what does NATO do in the face of Russian opposition? And the answer is, we double down. And we basically think we can shove NATO expansion down Russia's throat. And there's just nothing they can do about it because they're so weak. We could do after 2008 what we did in 1999 and what we did in 2004. But of course, that proves not to be the case. This is a very different situation. And you have a major crisis that breaks out in 2014. This is when the Russians take Crimea, as you well know, and the civil war on the Donbass breaks out. This is 2014. I want to emphasize that between 2008 and 2014, even though we doubled down and we were expanding NATO so as to bring in Ukraine, we were not doing that with the thought in mind that we had to contain Russia. That was not part of the program. There may have been a few people in the bowels of the establishment who were thinking in those terms, but that's not the way policymakers were talking, as best we can tell from the available evidence. After 2014, after February 22nd, 2014, when the major crisis breaks out in Ukraine, we do a 180-degree turn, and all of a sudden, we're painting the Russians, and Putin in particular, as a really serious threat to Europe that has to be contained. So it's just important to understand that it's in 2014 that containment of Russia gets linked to NATO expansion. That is not the case before 2014. I want to make one further point on this, and that is a lot of the planning documents from the 1990s are now publicly available. And it's very clear from those documents that the Americans understood, the policymaking establishment understood that bringing Ukraine into NATO was a very special case. And you were really asking for trouble if you brought Ukraine into NATO. American policymakers understood that Ukraine was probably a bridge too far. And of course, in April 2008, at the NATO Bucharest summit, when we say that we're going to bring Ukraine into NATO, it's perfectly clear that all our fears were justified. But again, just to repeat myself, because it's very important, instead of backing off and trying to accommodate the Russians, we believe that we can shove NATO expansion into Ukraine down their throat. And we find out on February 24th, 2022, that we were wrong. We can't shove it down their throat. They will not accept it. And here we are today in the middle of a war that has gone on now for over 3 years because of our unwillingness or our inability to accept the fact that this would be NATO expansion, that is, an existential threat to Russia.
This inability to appreciate the fact that the Russians sees this as an existential threat, it appears to be somewhat at the heart of this conflict, because when you hear certain politicians, media, or even speak with them, you get the impression that they do genuinely believe, many of them, that Russia shouldn't have any concern whatsoever about NATO expanding on its borders, any weapon systems. But again, this is why your articles and books kind of stood out, especially in 2014. You had this article in Foreign Affairs with the title, "Why the Ukraine Crisis," I think it was, is the West's fault. Again, this is something like waving a red flag in front of many of the political establishment. But it was very hard for many people to appreciate that this could be that the Russian security concerns were legitimate. And again, in 2015, you made this speech, which must have been seen millions of times, in which he argued that the United States was leading Ukraine down the primrose path, suggesting some of it was well-intentioned, but it would destroy Ukraine. Why, or how did you see this? Because now 10 years, of course, what you said would happen happened, but and you wrote that the end result would be Ukraine getting wrecked. Is this solely because Russia had to defend its, fight for its survival, or how do you see this?
Great question. And I think the way to conceptualize this is to emphasize the distinction between liberalism and realism. As I said to you before, Glenn, when the Cold War ends and we, the United States, end up as the unipole, we're the only great power on the planet. So we do not have to worry about realist logic. We do not have to worry about the balance of power. The United States is free to act according to the dictates of liberalism, which we do. And many people are arguing, including President Clinton, that realism is no longer relevant for understanding international politics. So when we begin to expand eastward toward Ukraine, We believe that realpolitik is dead and that we are a benign liberal hegemon. I cannot tell you how many times I have heard important people in the foreign policy establishment say that Russia had nothing to fear from NATO expansion because we were a liberal and benign hegemon. Mike McFaul has told me that he told Putin this on a number of occasions, and I believe that Mike McFaul believed this. The problem is that from a Russian point of view, the world was being viewed through realist lenses. From a Russian point of view, the United States was a behemoth. It ran an alliance that had been a mortal enemy during the Cold War. And the United States was marching that alliance up to Russia's doorsteps. From a Russian point of view, this was all seen through realist lenses. From an American point of view, realism is dead and it was seen from a liberal perspective. So you had this real clash of, uh, let's call them ideologies for lack of a better term. You had this real clash of ideologies or worldviews that was destined to lead to huge trouble because the Americans simply couldn't put themselves in the shoes of the Russians. I always found this amazing. I used to say, can't you understand why, from a Russian perspective, NATO expansion into Ukraine looks threatening? Realism 101 tells you that's the case. This, of course, is why George Kennan opposed NATO expansion in the 1990s, and many others, like Bill Perry, who was the Secretary of Defense, opposed NATO expansion. They were thinking about it from a realist framework. They were basically saying that if you're the Russians and you see NATO marching up to your doorstep, this is going to cause huge problems. But the vast majority of people in the foreign policy establishment just were not thinking about how international relations works in those terms, in those realist terms. They viewed it more in liberal terms. This is why we were not really interested in containing Russia until 2014. And this is why American policymakers could argue that the Russians have nothing to fear. The United States is a benign hegemon. For a realist like me, it's crazy for people to talk like that. That's just not the way the world works. But if you're a thoroughgoing liberal and you believe that liberalism is the dominating ideology in international politics, now that the Cold War is over with, you don't think in those terms. You think that a country like the United States and NATO are benign actors on the world stage. So you had this complete uh, mismatch in worldviews. And both sides, ended up as a result in a major crisis in 2014 and then in a major war in 2022.
This is often the dark side of the liberal theories. If you assume that it's internal characteristics of states that dictate their behavior, you would assume that some actors are inherently good, some are inherently aggressive, because when you post, which you have done in your articles as well, where you say, well, let's put ourselves in the shoes of the Russians. If the Russians or the Chinese were establishing military bases and putting up their missiles in Mexico, would the United States not react in the same way? And usually the response one would get was, well, it can't be compared because, again, as you suggest, we are benign. So these are good weapons versus bad weapons, effectively. So it becomes very difficult to put yourself in the shoes of the opponent. I guess, in the struggle between liberalism and realism, the Europeans, they strike me as very constructivist as well. They fear that the language you use socially constructs a world. So there's it leads to an assumption that the mere realist analysis is somehow immoral. If you say that the Russians should be concerned about NATO and its borders, you are effectively normalizing Cold War thinking. And so the best thing you should do is not say it. So you should not put yourself in the shoes of the opponent, because you might legitimize this idea of realpolitik, that this is something we haven't overcome yet. But it does take me to another argument we often hear with Ukraine, which is Ukraine has the right to join any military alliance it desires, and it should be allowed to choose its own security arrangements, which sounds awfully moral, because it suggests sovereignty. If you don't accept this, it suggests Russia should have a say over Ukraine. However, if you translate this into actual politics, it led to the destruction of Ukraine. So how would you redefine, I guess, morality from a realist perspective then?
Well, I agree with everything you said. When you talk about Ukraine having the right to choose its own foreign policy and therefore to join any alliance that it sees fit to join, it's a very attractive argument from a liberal point of view because, as you well know, liberals place a high premium on rights. So if you say that somebody has a right as a sovereign state, or a country has a right as a sovereign state to join NATO, there's a certain intuitive attractiveness to that argument. I fully understand. But again, in the real world, realism basically frames how people think about international politics. And from a Russian point of view, what they want to know with regard to Ukraine joining NATO is how that affects their security. The Russians are interested in their security. The Ukrainians are interested in their security. The Americans are interested in their security. This is just the way the world works. It makes perfect sense. Every state should want to maximize its security. Well, from the Russian point of view, they may think that Ukraine has certain rights, but from the Russian point of view, what's most important is their security. And Ukraine exercising its so-called right to join NATO threatens their security. And by the way, they think it threatens their security in an existential way. We cannot underestimate that. Many people in the West will say, oh, it's Ukraine joining NATO is not an existential threat to Russia. Well, they may not think it is, but the Russians think it is, and it's what the Russians think that matters. They think it's an existential threat. So I believe that if you are Ukraine, you have to take into account Russian thinking on the matter of Ukraine, joining NATO. And if you don't, you're going to get yourself into really deep trouble. And I think many Ukrainians initially understood that. But as time went by, the number of Ukrainians who understood that logic seemed to diminish. And what happened is that the West and the Ukrainian foreign policy establishment both came to the conclusion that Ukraine had this right and Ukraine could just do whatever they want. And NATO, by the way, we want to emphasize, has an open door policy. It can invite any country that it wants into the alliance. And the Russians don't have a veto over that. That was their thinking. Well, the Russians simply refused to accept that logic. And the end result is that Ukraine is in the process of being destroyed. This is a travesty. It's just hard to believe how terrible this is for Ukraine. And this is all a result of the fact that we in the West believed that Ukraine had a right to join NATO, and NATO had a right to invite Ukraine into the alliance. And if the Russians didn't like it, that was just too bad. They had to accept it. And we acted on that basic logic, and the end result is we have played a central role, maybe the central role, in destroying Ukraine.
Well, if NATO had negotiated some kind of a security system in Europe with the Russians based on mitigating the security competition, of course, this could have taken Ukraine away from being a front line. But it seemed that when NATO said, well, we have an open door policy, Ukraine has been invited, it wasn't possible for Russia to discuss anymore with NATO because a decision had been made. And instead, the pressure had then to be put on Ukraine not to accept these offers, which is why I guess you end up with a war. But Now that we're in this 3+ years since the Russian invasion, or more than a decade since, again, 2014, how do you end the Ukraine war from a realist view? Because uh, I don't hear any constructive thoughts coming out of the European capitals, especially. The main argument is still, well, Ukraine has a lot to fear now from Russia, which I wouldn't disagree with. They certainly do, but so NATO still has to be um, on the table, and Russia will just have to accept this. Just don't bend the knee to the Russians and keep insisting on this, that this is the moral thing to do. So I guess from the realist perspective, how do you end the Ukraine war?
Well, from an American perspective, I'm principally concerned about the rise of China. I'm principally interested in containing China, not interested in fighting a war with China, but I want to make sure that China does not dominate Asia the way that it would like to. And from my point of view, as a realist, what I'm interested in doing is putting an end to the Ukraine war as quickly as possible, so that the United States can pivot to Asia fully, and so that the United States can have better relations with the Russians. At this point, it's hard to imagine us having good relations with the Russians, but hopefully we could have better relations. So if I'm the United States, I'd go to great lengths to shut down the war with a negotiated settlement. And that means accepting the main Russian demands. And there are three of them, in my opinion. One is that that Ukraine has to be neutral. That means it cannot be in NATO, and there cannot be Western, especially American security guarantees. It has to be a truly neutral Ukraine. Number two, Ukraine has to disarm somewhat, at least to the point where it does not have significant offensive capability that could threaten Russia. And number three, Ukraine has to accept the fact that it has lost Crimea and those four oblasts in the eastern part of Ukraine that the Russians have already annexed. So those are the three principal demands. And if I'm Donald Trump, I would accept those demands. I'd go to great lengths to work out a deal, accepting those three main demands. And by the way, I think that agreement would be in Ukraine's interest. I think Ukraine has a deep-seated interest in ending this war as soon as possible. And the only way to end it as soon as possible with an agreement is by accepting Russia's main demands. So I think this is in Ukraine's interest as well as in the United States' interest. And again, as I said, we meaning the Americans, then be able to pivot to Asia, where we could focus on containing China. Now, the problem that we face here is, first of all, the Ukrainians won't accept this deal. There's no way they're going to give up that territory. And I think it's extremely unlikely that they will be willing to go along without some sort of security guarantee. And disarming, I don't see them doing that either. So I find it hard to imagine the Ukrainians accepting those demands, Putin's demands. Furthermore, I find it hard to imagine the Europeans accepting those demands, because I think the Europeans have a vested interest in seeing the war go on. And the reason is they want to keep the Americans in Europe. Uh, I actually believe European leaders' greatest fear is not the Russians. They don't worry that much about a Russian threat. They engage in threat inflation, but it's mainly rhetoric. Their greatest fear is the United States will leave Europe. And if the United States remains committed to an ongoing war in Ukraine, even if it's at a reduced level, the Americans remain in Europe. So I don't think you're going to get the Europeans to go along with the deal either. So even if the Americans want to cut a deal, I don't think the Europeans or the Ukrainians are going to cut that deal. That's a deal on Putin's terms. So I think, Glenn, the sad truth is that this one is going to be settled on the battlefield. That's what my sort of realist framework tells me. You're not going to get a negotiated settlement. And then the only interesting question is, does the United States pull out of Europe for the most part? Does it pull its troops out? And that's a serious possibility because of the need to pivot to Asia. And we don't want to lose sight of the fact that there's also the whole Middle East mess, right? Because the United States is joined at the hip with Israel, we give lots of weaponry to Israel that could be used by the Ukrainians, and more importantly, could be used in East Asia to deal with the Chinese. And we have all sorts of military assets deployed in the Middle East, and so forth and so on. So the United States, if you really think about it from a grand strategic point of view, is involved in three areas of the world. One is East Asia, two is Europe slash Ukraine, and three is the Middle East. And it's in our interest to greatly reduce our presence in the Middle East and in Europe and to focus on East Asia. But we're unable to do that. It's really quite remarkable, the situation we are in. We are deeply involved in the Middle East. There's no evidence that that's going to change. And we are deeply involved in Ukraine. And if you look at what Trump is doing, for all his talk about ending the Ukraine war, improving relations with the Russians, and reducing our presence in Europe, he's not done much of anything on those three fronts. So, we're pretty much back where we were when he entered the White House on January 20th of this year.
This is this is what I thought was the great hope of Trump, the ability to pull out of the Middle East and Europe. Again, this is what he was communicating as well during the campaign. But you said, of course, as an American, but if you were a European or advising the Europeans, what would you do in this position that Europe's in now? Because as you said, there's this dilemma. If the Europeans kind of need the United States to remain in Europe as a pacifier to prevent security competition between the Europeans, but also to elevate the relevance of Europe, I guess. But the more the Europeans attempt to pull in the Americans into Europe, be it through perpetuating the war in Ukraine or through these horrible trade agreements, which, anything to keep the Americans there, then the Europeans will become economically weaker, more unstable, and overall it will become less and less relevant, and the US will lose further interest in Europe. So what is what would you advise to the Europeans at this point, as we're stuck in economic decline, and again, we're now almost in a direct war with the world's largest nuclear power?
If I were the Europeans, I would do the opposite of what I think they are doing. I'd go to great lengths to shut down the war in Ukraine, get the best possible deal for Ukraine, and then at the same time improve relations with Russia, and do that with the thought in mind that good relations with Russia and good relations with China are essential for European economic growth. I'd go to great lengths, of course, not to antagonize the Americans, and do everything I could to keep the Americans in Europe. But if I were a European, I would accept the fact that it is likely that the Americans will leave Europe in good part. I think you can make an argument that Trump is a bit of an anomaly, and once Trump is gone, we can go back to business as usual. I wouldn't put a lot of stock in that argument, but it would be an argument I'd pay some attention to, and I'd go to some lengths to have, or I'd go to great lengths to have good relations with the Americans in case things do improve once Trump leaves. But if I'm the Europeans, I'm not betting a lot of money on American support down the road. The United States is basically a rogue elephant. I think most European leaders understand that behind closed doors. They won't say it publicly, although occasionally it pops out. But, is the United States really a trustworthy ally anymore? If you're a European, do you want to put all your chips in that basket? I don't think so. The United States looks like it's an irresponsible state. Donald Trump does not look like a leader that I'd want to, place a lot of reliance on. So if I'm the Europeans, I'd think about improving relations with the Russians, shutting down the Ukraine war, and rebuilding economies.
Well, this all sounds like common sense, but do you think it's the liberal delusion that prevents us from pursuing what is essentially common sense? Because the realist analysis you present now, they used to be normal and acceptable, but these days, as I mentioned before, it's seen as being deeply immoral and even a betrayal of our liberal values. That this would lead to the breakup of the political West, which is the foundation of liberal hegemony, and it would mean cozying up against Russia, which is an authoritarian power. Is this what's preventing us from doing it? This liberal delusions about how the world works?
I don't know whether it's liberal delusions or just plain delusions. When I listen to European leaders speak uh, about the Ukraine war, I think they are by and large delusional. I don't understand fully why that is the case, uh, but it's just sort of hard to understand uh, uh, why European leaders are just not more hard-headed about what's going on here. It could be, Glenn, that my basic point that the Europeans worry more than anything else about the United States leaving Europe, and therefore they think that it's important to keep the Ukraine war going and keep the Americans in the fight, is what's driving this train. And one could argue if that's true, that's not delusional. That makes good strategic sense. The Europeans have a goal here, which is to keep the Americans in Europe, and they're doing what's necessary to make that happen. So you could make that argument. Uh, I think it's a wrong-headed argument. I think the Europeans are delusional, uh, but uh, but who knows? I think one of the interesting questions is what happens over the next 10 years as the elites uh, who, came of age in the unipolar moment pass on, and they're replaced by a new set of elites who are not consumed with this liberal view of the West as the good guy, and who understand that the West is in trouble and that, significant changes have to be made in the way Europe does business. I think it's going to be very interesting to watch that because we are at a plastic moment in history. Just very important to understand that. The unipolar moment is over, and we're now in a multipolar world, and that's slowly but steadily becoming very clear to everyone. And we're not only in a multipolar world, but if you look at what's happening inside European states and even the United States, is you have a huge amount of immigration into these societies. And there's just a lot more change taking place inside of these states than was the case in the past or in the recent past. And I think that given that, Europeans don't make large numbers of babies and they're probably going to end up importing lots of people, I think that what happens inside the various European states is going to be a source of friction, a source of real trouble. These states are not states that have a rich history of absorbing immigrants in a smooth way. Even the United States, which has a rich history of absorbing immigrants, has not had a smooth ride all along. All you have to do is look at immigration into the United States from about 1830, 1835 up till 1924 when we shut the gates. That's when all the European immigrants came in. It was a quite messy process. Immigration is very hard to manage. And what I'm saying is there's going to be a lot of immigration into Europe. There already has been, but there's going to be more in the future. And how that's handled is going to be a very tricky issue. And so I think inside states, we're at a plastic moment. And I think in terms of international politics, we're at a plastic moment. Just talking about the pivot to Asia and what that means. So looking at what's going on in the Middle East, thinking about, what's the future of relations between Russia and Europe. Leave Ukraine out. What's the relationship look like between Russia on one side and Europe on the other? Doesn't look very good to me moving forward. And I think there's a lot up in the air.
Just as a last question for, I guess, concluding remarks, why do you think liberal hegemony was always doomed to fail? It does appear that it's failed now that NATO is contributing greatly, to the destruction of Ukraine. We're now very much complicit in genocide in the Middle East. There's no hegemony anymore. It doesn't seem very liberal. It's a bit like the Holy Roman Empire ended when it wasn't holy, it wasn't Roman, and it wasn't an empire. But why was it doomed to fail from the beginning, from your perspective?
Well, I think the best way to answer that question is to talk about the relationship between liberalism on one hand and nationalism and realism on the other hand. I think talking about those three ideologies and how they relate to each other tells you a lot about what went wrong. Uh, as I said when we were talking about NATO expansion into Ukraine, the Russians were thinking as realists, and the Americans and their European allies were thinking as liberals. And when you put realism up against liberalism, realism wins every time. Uh, Furthermore, when you put nationalism up against liberalism, nationalism wins every time. It's very important to understand that liberal hegemony was all about interfering in the politics of other countries for the main purpose of turning them into liberal democracies. You just want to think about this. Liberal hegemony was all about spreading liberalism across the planet, creating a globe that was populated by nothing but liberal democracies. You remember when the Cold War ends, Francis Fukuyama writes this very famous article called The End of History. And the Fukuyama argument basically says that we in the West defeated fascism in the first half of the 20th century, communism in the second half of the 20th century, and the future is all liberalism. States are going to turn into liberal democracies and in an inexorable way. This is why Frank concludes at the end of his essay that the future is going to be boring. It's going to be boring because the world is populated by liberal democracies. Well, what that does is it leaves the United States to think that it can spread liberal democracy all over the planet, and oftentimes at the end of a rifle barrel. But the problem is that nationalism is going to get in the way because nation states, that's the embodiment of the concept of nationalism. Nation states resist other states interfering in their politics and telling them what kind of political system they can have. So you have the United States going into the Middle East with the Bush Doctrine for the express purpose of turning the Middle East into a sea of liberal democracies. We're basically saying we could go in to the Middle East and we can interfere in the politics of sovereign states and we can turn them into liberal democracies because liberal democracy is the best possible political order for everybody. And furthermore, Frank Fukuyama tells us that this is inevitable anyway. Well, when you think like that, it's not long before you run up against nationalism. And nationalism is where countries say, we are sovereign states and we'll decide what kind of political system we have. And we don't want you invading our country and telling us what to do. So, in a very important way, you see that this liberal foreign policy ran up against realism And it ran up against nationalism because this liberal foreign policy involves, right, pushing other countries around in ways that might violate their security. And furthermore, and that's where the realism comes in, and furthermore, it calls for interfering in the domestic politics. It calls for challenging the sovereignty of other states. And that brings nationalism into play. And the best example, just very quickly to highlight this, is China. The United States adopted a policy of engagement towards China. Engagement is just another way of saying liberal hegemony. What was the United States trying to do with China? What we wanted to do was we wanted to turn China into a liberal democracy. We went to great lengths to help it grow economically. We wanted to get it hooked on capitalism. We wanted to foster economic interdependence between China and other countries. Furthermore, we wanted to integrate China into international institutions like the World Trade Organization. And the widespread belief, Glenn, was that China would eventually become a liberal democracy. And once it became a liberal democracy, we would all live happily ever after. But you have to put yourself in the shoes of Chinese leaders in Beijing. First of all, they don't want the United States turning China into a liberal democracy. The Chinese believe that they'll decide what kind of political system they will have, and they don't want the American political system. They don't want liberal democracy. So you get resistance from China to this liberal hegemony that's based on nationalism. And then furthermore, there's the realist dimension to this. The Chinese, much like the Russians, unsurprisingly fear American military power. They fear the Unipol. And as China gets richer, unsurprisingly, it turns its economic might into military might. Now, all of these liberal hegemonists in the West say, why are the Chinese doing that? They have nothing to fear from the United States. The United States is a benign hegemon. Well, if you're sitting in Beijing, just like if you're sitting in Moscow or you're sitting in Baghdad, the United States doesn't look like a benign hegemon. It looks like a serious threat. Again, you see realist logic kicking in and you see nationalism kicking in. The idea that we are sovereign states and we don't want the United States telling us how to do business. As you know, when people start talking about the Russians involved in getting involved in an American election, the whole Russiagate business, which of course was not true, but Americans talked about uh, Russian interference in the 2016 election. This enraged Americans. Why? Because we thought the Russians were violating American sovereignty. I want to be clear, they weren't, right? This is all a myth. But let's assume the myth was true. The belief was that they were violating our sovereignty. This is unacceptable. This is nationalism at play. It's nationalism inside the United States. Well, unsurprisingly, other countries around the world think in the same way. So the bottom line, Glenn, is that we adopted, when the Cold War ended, this policy of liberal hegemony, which was basically a liberal theory of how to deal with the world. And it ran into realism and nationalism. And it ultimately failed.
I think it's important what you said there, that because it's not as if it's liberal democracies only West and the rest of the world are nationalists, that this is also within the West, that is the United States, and also has nationalism. So it is, and I think ignoring this is also part of the reason why we have this populist revolt now. But again, this liberal delusion, I think this is why. Well, at the moment, Beijing is watching NATO in war with Russia. They're watching the attack on Iran, and still, it's argued that they should not fear anything. That we're all benign. It seems a bit like crazy town for them, but I guess that hits the core.
Yeah, if I can make one more point, Glenn, just on your comment about the fact that the Americans were thinking very much like nationalists. What's interesting is that during the unipolar moment, when we were pursuing this liberal foreign policy, there was all sorts of evidence that we were thinking very much according to the logic of nationalism, although we would never acknowledge this. And the best example of this is Madeleine Albright and her famous or infamous comment that the United States is the indispensable nation, that we stand taller and we see further. If you think about that, and remember, Madeleine Albright is a liberal of the first order. I mean, if there's anybody who embodies liberal hegemony, it's got to be Madeleine Albright. But at the same time, she's a first order nationalist. Listen to what she's saying. We, meaning the United States, we are the indispensable nation. There's the word, nation, nationalism. We stand taller. We see further. This is the chauvinism that invariably lies at the heart of any nationalism, right? Virtually every country believes that it is the chosen people, right? We are the city on the hill, right? That's nationalism. So here you have Madeleine Albright, right? This card carrying liberal who's also a card carrying nationalist. And what Madeleine Albright is that she's a liberal nationalist. This is a term that we used to use when I was in graduate school to describe Max Weber. He was a liberal nationalist, right? Madeleine Albright is a liberal nationalist, but she does not understand, or she did not understand, the nationalist dimension of her identity. She didn't understand that she was a nationalist and that others in the world think in terms of nationalism as well as liberalism. So that means you have to be extremely careful when you start talking about interfering in the politics of other countries, because nationalism, again, is such a powerful force.
I guess there's a danger of ignoring realism because I think it was Raymond Aron. He wrote in the 1960s that the idealist, believing that he has broken with power politics, exaggerates its crimes, and this is when you have the liberal assumption fueled with the realist or nationalist realities. And yeah, I think it's very relevant to see the conflicts which we're involved in today.
Well, the thing is, Glenn, just building on your point, most people think that realists are warmongers, right? This gets back to your point about social constructivists who see realists as the principal cause of all our troubles in the world. And if only the realists would go away, we'd live happily ever after. The fact is that realists like you and realists like me and realists like George Kennan and realists like Raymond Aron have a very healthy sense of the limits of power. That's why we would not have favored NATO expansion into Ukraine. And we would have avoided this giant catastrophe that we're now facing, because realists understand, yes, power matters, but there are limits to what you can do in international politics because other states will balance against you. Liberals, on the other hand, tend to cut in the other direction. You know, it's the whole idea that we, the Americans, we, the West, we're the good guys. We can expand here, there, and everywhere, and people will understand that we're benign because we're liberal. And they, liberals, do not have a healthy sense of the limits of military power, and they end up pursuing a very ambitious agenda to boot. You want to remember that liberal hegemony is all about turning the entire planet into a body of states that look like the United States. That's our goal. We want to make everybody look like us, and we're willing to do it at the end of a rifle barrel. This is going to end up with a lot of forever wars. This is very foolish. And of course, realists argue against that. So my bottom line here is that you'd have fewer wars if realists were in charge than when liberals are in charge. And furthermore, with regard to Ukraine, if the realists had been in charge, Ukraine would be fully intact today, in all likelihood, inside its pre 2014 borders. But instead, the country is now a dysfunctional rump state and is going to remain a dysfunctional rump state because the West and the Ukrainians did not act according to realist logic